Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Traveling Librarian. This is Jeff Clapes from the Reference Department at BB Library with some more armchair travel for you so you can see the world without leaving your home. WCAT here in Wakefield has generously partnered with BB Library to help us continue to bring our programming to you however we can. And I'm pleased to have you join me today for a tour of the historic city of Budapest in Hungary. As well as on WCAT, you can find these programs and more on the library's YouTube channel. And for more armchair travel photography, I hope you will follow me on Instagram. And also, eventually, once the library reopens, I hope you will be able to join me back there to tour other interesting destinations as well. But let's get started with Hungary. Hungary is an Eastern European country with about 10 million people, so slightly larger than Massachusetts. And about roughly the size of Maine in terms of square miles. It joined the European Union in 2004. The capital, which we'll be focusing on today, is Budapest, which has about 3.5 million people in the metro area, which means that roughly a third of the population of the entire country is focused right around the capital. It was originally a Celtic and Roman settlement. The Hungarians arrived there in the 9th century under Arpad and his dynasty, and they consider the founding of the city to be the year 896. Throughout its history, it was attacked by the Mongols. It was a major city during the Renaissance. In the mid-16th century, it was occupied by the Ottomans for about a century and a half. And eventually, the western part of the country became part of the Habsburg Empire. The trip that I took there was a few years ago, and I started in Budapest, which you can see way over on the far left of the image. And then I spent about 2 weeks wandering around Romania, which is also a fascinating country that I hope to take you to at some point in the future. By 1718, the city and the rest of the country had been incorporated into the Habsburg Empire. And then in 1848, in the next century, revolutions which swept through much of Europe attempted to bring independence to Hungary, but failed. Austro-Hungary became a united empire in 1867, and then in 1873, the cities of Buda, Óbuda, and Pest, which had previously been separate entities, were united into one. You can see that the capital actually is in the extreme north of the country, not far from the border with Slovakia, and it's only a very short train ride from Vienna over on the west. Now, the city itself was around the turn of the 20th century, in 1900, was roughly a quarter Jewish. Many of the Germans that had previously been in that area during the previous century had been pushed out slowly by ethnic Hungarians. And then after Austro-Hungary lost in World War I, Hungary declared independence. It was partitioned and lost roughly about half of its territory, mostly Transylvania, which is now part of Romania. And a large number of ethnic Hungarians ended up in Romania, where many of them remain today, over on the west side of that country. In World War II, the Battle of Budapest caused significant damage to the city, and of course, many of the 250,000 Jews who lived there were killed during the Holocaust. After the war, the country went communist, but in 1956, there was an important anti-Soviet uprising, which lasted for about 2 weeks and was brutally suppressed by the Soviets. And during that time period, about 3,000 people died in the city. Imre Nagy was declared the prime minister. He abandoned communism, but was executed 2 years later for treason. We're going to see him a little bit later. Finally, in 1989, there was the fall of the Iron Curtain, and gradually Hungary became much more westernized and a part of the European Union and the country we know today. In recent years, it has been run by a gentleman named Viktor Orban, who is a very right-wing populist leader, and that has significantly changed some of the tenor of the country, and we'll see what happens in the coming years. However, Budapest is and has always been a major destination for travelers. By being on the Danube, it's a popular cruise destination, and it's a major cosmopolitan city in Eastern Europe. So let's take a look. This is the pension that we stayed in on the west side of the Danube, in the part of the city known as Buda. It's a neighborhood of old mansions, big, beautiful old mansions. Many of them have gardens around them like this one did. This is a view from the window out over the city. And just below our guest house, which did incidentally come with a dog. I am a big fan of any kind of place to stay that provides its own dog for you to play with. But very, very close in the same neighborhood where we stayed is a huge complex called the Galert Hotel and Spa. Hungary is noted for its spas and baths. We're going to visit a couple of them very soon. The hill that this neighborhood is on is named for Bishop Galert, who was killed in the 11th century. This complex was built around World War I in the Vienna Secession style, which is the name for Art Nouveau in Eastern Europe. But it also has a lot of Oriental influence. This hotel was damaged during World War II, but then was rebuilt after the war and has been beautifully restored. It's a very elegant and expensive hotel, but even if you're not staying there, you can also take advantage of the many spa opportunities, hot and cold swimming pools. And if nothing else, it's worth just wandering around the inside to see how beautiful it is. Hungary is full of that secessionist Art Nouveau style architecture, and for decades it has been known as the Paris of the East, because it does have a very cosmopolitan, beautiful, elegant style to the whole city. This is the exterior of that building. And in addition to all the spa facilities inside, there's also a very nice outdoor pool. It was a little chilly the day that we were there, so there weren't very many people. And here's a view of it at night. Budapest is focused on the Danube River. It's a major port on this 1,800-mile-long river, the longest in the European Union. This is the chain bridge, one of many bridges over the river in the middle of the city. Budapest is known as being a city of bridges, and each one has its own unique style and elegance. This is called the chain bridge, the Cecheny Bridge, which was built in 1849 and was actually the first permanent bridge to be built over the river. It was commissioned by Count Cecheny, who was forced to miss his father's funeral because there was no easy way to get across the river. So he commissioned this bridge. It was designed by a Scotsman and virtually destroyed during World War II, but completely rebuilt. As you stroll along the river, you can see beautiful buildings on both sides, along with a number of the river cruise ships that, that often start or end their itineraries in Budapest. That's one of the theaters, the National Theater across the way. And a view of a road race that was happening the day we were there along the banks of the Danube. All of the bridges are lit up at night, which makes it a very beautiful spot to stroll. And it was nice to be able to have the bridge completely pedestrianized the day that we were there, because of this road race. Across the river on the hill, we're looking to the west side now. That's Buda Castle, which we'll visit a little bit later, up on the hill. The west side of the river is very high. There's a number of good-sized hills that give very big, beautiful views across the river. The Pest side on the east is actually quite flat and very different both in the style of architecture and the design of the city. That's St. Matthias Church off in the distance. We'll visit that again close up in a little bit. Opposite the Sachini Bridge on the Pest side of the river, is the Gresham Palace Hotel, which was built in 1906. Again, like many of the most noted buildings in the city, designed in that Art Nouveau Vienna secessionist style. For a while, it was an office building. It also served as the barracks for the Red Army when the country was occupied by the Soviets. Then it became an apartment building, and now it is a very elegant Four Seasons hotel with some spectacular details, both inside and out. This is the lobby. Again, this is St. Matthias Church across the river with the famous Fisherman's Bastion, which is the sort of iconic image of the city looking out over the river to the Houses of Parliament on the opposite side. And this is a close-up view of the Houses of Parliament. These are the third largest Parliament buildings in the world, after those in London and Bucharest. The complex was built in the late 19th century, from 1885 till about 1902, and it was the result of an architectural competition. It's based on the buildings in London, and you can see a certain similarity. It has almost 700 rooms in the building, and also houses the 1,000-year-old crown of St. Stephen. That's a symbol of the city and of the country. That crown was actually kept in the United States during World War II for safekeeping. It was spirited out of the country and stored in Fort Knox in the United States between World War II and 1978, when President Jimmy Carter returned it back to the country of Hungary. You can tour the Parliament buildings, and it's well worth doing that so that you can see both the inside and the outside. They have a very nice museum. And if you've visited the Parliament buildings in London, you will definitely see a similarity in style. Although these are, if anything, even more over the top in terms of decoration. This is the main entrance hall. Parliament is also beautifully lit up at night, and if you stroll the river, it's a spectacular evening walk after dinner to see all of the major public buildings lit up. Just across the park from Parliament is this building, which is the Ethnographic Museum. This was also part of an architectural competition and was actually a runner-up. The architect who designed this was a runner-up for the Parliament competition. This building once housed the Supreme Court, and is now the Ethnographic Museum of Hungary. There's a similar building just a block away, both of them facing Parliament, and that is now used as the Ministry of Agriculture. Here's a wartime monument with a much trendier modern tourist in front of it. Now, you'll remember a few minutes ago I mentioned Imre Nagy, the first prime minister. He abandoned communism, but was later executed 2 years later for treason. However, he is still considered an important historical figure and is highly regarded in Hungary even today. However, this statue, which once stood in the park not far from the Parliament building, was recently removed in the end of 2018 by Viktor Orban's government. And it was quite controversial because there were obvious political overtones to the decision. and the statue has been moved to a sort of out of the way remote location in the city, and it still rankles a lot of the Hungarians today. Ironically, just around the corner is Ronald Reagan. This statue was erected in 2011 to honor his involvement in the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. All around Liberty Square, which is the main political center of the city in Pest, is the US Embassy and a number of other very beautiful Art Nouveau buildings. This is a somewhat controversial monument to the Soviet liberation from the Nazis during World War II. A postal building, and this gorgeous building is the National Treasury, which is an absolutely extravagant Art Nouveau style building with beautiful ceramic tile colored roof. Looking down one of the main avenues in Pest, you can see this massive domed building, which is the main cathedral for the city. It's called St. Stephen's Basilica. It's actually a 19th century church built quite obviously in a very neoclassical style. St. Stephen is the patron saint of Hungary, and he was Hungary's first Christian king. This church was built around 1896, and it has what is supposed to be a reliquary of St. Stephen's hand, 1,000 years old, in the building. The huge plaza in front of it was very recently a parking lot, but has been completely redesigned to be a beautiful outdoor space in front of the cathedral for pedestrians only, and actually has a parking garage underneath. Here are just some examples of the kind of architecture and street scenes that you would see strolling around the city. Like Paris, with which it is often compared, Budapest is a beautiful city for strolling. It has shops, restaurants, very stylish buildings, and very stylish people. It's a place for walking and being seen. Also, like Paris, it focuses on its river. Both sides of the river have elegant buildings and promenades up and down throughout the entire city, and the views are quite dramatic. This is looking across to the Buda side of the river, which we'll visit in a little bit. And some of the many gorgeous bridges that cross the Danube. Budapest, also being a major city, does have another side to it as well. Here's the sex shop. Train station. And some more Art Nouveau. They do also have an excellent public transit system. There are trains and metro system and buses throughout the entire city, and in fact all over Hungary. And they even have what are known as booby bikes, which are the bike rental systems that allow you to cycle around the city, particularly on the east side of the Danube and the Pest part of the city, which is relatively flat. Cycling is a very convenient way to get around. I liked this restaurant known as the Fatal Restaurant. Obviously in Hungarian it's pronounced differently. An owl perched on a building, and another of the bridges. This unusual building is called the New Budapest Gallery, which is a sort of whale-shaped modern structure that was built in and around two existing wharf warehouses, and it's now a big shopping and exhibition complex. And some more street scenes. This building is well worth visiting. This is right at the Liberty Bridge, another of the major bridges across the river. It was built for the millennium in 1896, 1,000 years rather after the founding of the city, and it was renovated again in 1999 into a spectacular food hall with products and crafts from all over Hungary. The building itself is worth visiting just for the architecture. It's absolutely enormous. And once you get in, you can see just how huge it is. But it's a virtual museum of Hungarian products. There are restaurants that you can eat at, but it's also a food hall with things for tourists, but also where local Hungarians shop for all kinds of local products from around the country: fruits, vegetables, meats, peppers used for paprika, all kinds of wines. Tokai is one of the premier wines in Hungary. It's a very sweet dessert wine. Preserved fruits and vegetables, and of course, paprika that comes in both hot and sweet varieties. Another important site that you shouldn't miss when you're in the city is the Great Synagogue, which is the largest Jewish house of worship in all of Europe. It seats 3,000 people and was built in the 1850s in a very sort of Byzantine style, neo-Moorish style. It also has a superb museum attached to it with relics, and also a Holocaust memorial that we'll see shortly. The decoration is superb, and the interior is an incredible dramatic space that rivals that of any other cathedral or house of worship in the city. It's an interesting style because although it is a temple, there are certain aspects of it that make it almost look like a Christian house of worship. This is the memorial garden in the back, and there is a Holocaust memorial called the Tree of Life that is like a weeping willow tree, and each of the metal leaves that you see has the name of a Jew who was killed during the Holocaust. This was partly funded, this memorial, by Tony Curtis, the actor, who is actually a Hungarian American. And it's an extremely moving experience. An unusual aspect of this synagogue is that it actually has two towers on it, which make it almost from a distance seem a little bit like a Christian church. But the description is actually from the biblical references to Solomon's temple. And it's one of the highlights of the city, certainly. We're going to cross the river now. You can see St. Stephen's Cathedral off in the background, looming over the Gresham Hotel. But we're going to cross the river and now go up onto the Buda side, which is the older part of the city. There's a superb view of the Houses of Parliament up the river. And you can take a funicular to get up to the top of the hill, where we will end up in the Castle district. The bird that you see on this sculpture, this bronze sculpture, is actually called a Tourel Bird, and it's a mythological creature that supposedly led the Magyars, the original ethnic Hungarians, led them west across Eastern Europe and brought them to settle in Hungary. The whole Castle district is kind of an odd mishmash of reconstructions from different time periods. Much of it was rebuilt after after World War II. The huge palace that you see here is now the National Gallery, which you can visit. And there's a variety of monuments and buildings from different time periods. including this building, which is called the Sundor Palace, which is a former mansion that is now the president's office. It's a very lovely area to stroll around. There are a number of churches and other monuments and museums. It's a very different style from the Pest side of the river because it's built on a hill and has more of a medieval feel to it with narrow twisting streets. This is the Matthias Church, which is 800 years old, although the building that you see here is actually mostly from the 19th century and then was later restored after damage during World War II. It stands on a gorgeous plaza. And you can see a crow on top of the steeple over on the right. That's symbolism is connected to Matthias Corvinus, who was a popular Renaissance king in Hungary, and his name is connected. It is the Latin word for crow, so you'll see a lot of that symbolism throughout the building. Inside and out, this is a beautiful church in the Gothic style. And the ceramic tile work on the roof is gorgeous. Just outside it is the Fisherman's Bastion, which is the sort of travel guidebook cover image that you'll usually see for Budapest. This was built about the same time as the church in 1896. There are 7 towers like the one you see in the back, and they symbolize the 7 tribes of Magyar ethnicity. But the best thing about it is that it is just a gorgeous park area, particularly on a sunny day, to be up and look over across the river. The views are spectacular. You can look down over the lower part of Buda, down at the river, and across to the flat Pest side. You can see the boat traffic going up and down the river. You can see all of the bridges and an absolutely amazing view of the Parliament buildings. The Bastion area has lots of nooks and crannies to climb over, statues, turrets, and all of it is presided over by this beautiful church with its late 19th century decoration. You'll see it's actually in some ways similar to the synagogue with that same style of painting and gold decoration, although this is much more Gothic rather than the sort of Byzantine style. There are frescoes and mosaics as well throughout the building, depicting Hungarian history. These are relics of St. Matthew himself. And beautiful stained glass. Strolling around the Buda neighborhood is wonderful for just getting an ice cream, sitting in a cafe, visiting museums. You'll see here an interesting juxtaposition. This is a very old tower in the district, flanked on the right by a sort of 19th century classical style building, and on the left by an extremely ugly post-war building, and they've stuck something ugly on the top of the tower as well. So because of all the damage that Budapest suffered during the war, there's a mix of beautiful and ugly throughout the city. But by and large, the Buda district is extremely beautiful, and much of the historic architecture has been restored. Back down on the river, we can see at night what I mentioned earlier, beautiful, beautiful buildings, completely lit up and down the river. This is Buda Castle from below, the Fisherman's Bastion and the various churches on the Buda side of the river, and the Parliament buildings. An unusual thing to see along the waterfront, not far from Parliament, is this bronze sculptural arrangement with a number of shoes stretching for quite a ways along the river. This is a memorial to honor the Jews who were killed in Budapest during World War II. Along the river here, they were ordered to take off their shoes, and then they were shot at the edge of the river where their bodies just fell into the river and were carried away. The monument with all of these shoes in bronze represents all of those who were killed during that time period. And more views along the river. Something that you absolutely must do when you are in Hungary, and there's a variety to choose from, is visit a bathhouse. There are all different kinds and styles of bathhouses. This particular one that we're looking at is called the Rudus bathhouse. It's one of the oldest in the city. And the dome that you can see with all those little bumps on it, those are tiny little colored skylights to bring light into the swimming area. And this is about 500 years old. Inside, you can visit a number of different rooms with different temperatures, pools that have different types of water, different degrees of minerality, and all different temperatures. It's a very common thing to do among Hungarians. In fact, their national health system pays for treatment at any one of the spas around the city. And for tourists, it's a great activity to just go in and relax and see what ordinary Hungarians will often do to relax. In this particular bathhouse, the days are differentiated. So on some days, men are allowed to go in, and other days, women are allowed to go in. It's very inexpensive, and it's worth going to a couple of different ones to see the different styles. We're going to visit one of the largest ones at the end of this, this presentation. That's a completely different style. Just a few more details of architecture. Here you can see a very modern building recently built across the street from something that's probably 100 years older. This is the Vigadó Concert Hall, which overlooks the river, which has beautiful opalescent glass sculptures and a fantastic lobby, and is used for public performances today. This unusual little sculpture is the Little Princess statue, a popular symbol of the city. And just to give you an idea of the other side, this is a good example of the kind of not so nice architecture that has unfortunately been plunked in certain parts of the city to replace war-damaged areas. But those are relatively few and far between. By and large, most of the city is absolutely gorgeous. Although they do have their McDonald's, like every other city in Europe. And a number of really nice pedestrianized areas that are designed to encourage shopping and restaurants and cafes, outdoor cafes, and so forth. We're going to take a quick trip outside of the city, though. This is known as Memento Park. It's about 10 kilometers or so southwest of the city, and it makes a great maybe half-day trip. It's an entire area where they have brought old socialist realism monumental sculptures into one place. And it's a kind of interesting history to look back on what Hungary experienced over the course of the 20th century. This unusual and quite large monument that you can see here is a reconstruction of the grandstand that Stalin used during the Soviet occupation of Hungary. This was built originally near Heroes Square, which we're going to visit shortly. And in 1956, during the uprising, the protesters chopped off the giant statue of Stalin at the knees, and all that was left were his feet. But this entire park is just, rather than completely obliterate their history, what they did is they brought much of this unusual 20th century sculpture into one place as a history lesson. So it's a kind of eerie and unusual place to visit, but there are excellent tour guides, many of whom grew up during this time period and can talk a little bit about what it's like to have gone through so many political changes in their lifetimes. Here's Lenin himself. And just to give you an idea, that reconstruction of the Stalin grandstand, this is an image in their museum that shows you what it looked like when it was originally built. You can see just how monumental that statue of Stalin was compared to the size of the people down below him. And there is a picture after the uprising when the statue had been removed. And of course, if you like Memento Park, you can follow them on Facebook. Back in the city, nothing makes the day better than to just have decent weather and stroll up and down along the river. Another thing that you can do to get slightly out of the city, although not as far, is to go upriver. You can get there even by walking or by taking the metro to a place called Margaret Island, which is a long, skinny island in the middle of the Danube. And it's now a vast park area with a number of attractions, and there's an amusement park and gardens and so forth. In the Middle Ages, King Bela asked God to save Hungary from the Tatars, and he said he would dedicate his daughter Margaret to the church. So he sent her to a nunnery on the island. This is what's left of that building. She later refused to have a political marriage that he wanted, and so she became Saint Margaret, and the island is named after her now. It's a beautiful place because it's so large. It feels very isolated, but it's actually extremely close to the city. There's a tower with a view and just endless gardens and parks to stroll through. And on a beautiful Sunday afternoon, with the kind of weather that you can see in this picture, there were tons and tons of people just enjoying the outdoors. Budapest has a number of beautiful parks within the city, but this is by far the biggest. And as I said, it's only a short, maybe 15-minute train ride on the metro. You can see some of the elegant electrical pylons that the electric trains use, and another one of the many bridges. If you have time, it's worth it to climb over on the Buda side. This is the west side of the Danube, to the Citadel, which is not far from Galert Hill, where we started. There are excellent views over the entire city. You can see St. Stephen's Cathedral off in the distance, and way off upriver, you can just see the dome of the Parliament building. There's also an excellent view north to the old city of Buda, where Buda Castle and the Fisherman's Bastion is. You can see this side of the river is much hillier, and this is the highest point. So there are great views in all directions. This is that giant market hall that we visited earlier. the exhibition hall. And looking south, just over to the right beyond the trees is that Galert Hotel and Spa complex that we saw at the very beginning. And a nice view of the many river cruises that go up and down, and many of them start here in Budapest or end here. This gigantic statue, which is, I want to say, something around 75 feet high, is known as the Liberty Statue, and it's from 1947, and again commemorates the Soviet liberation from the Nazis. Liberation is kind of a loaded word in this context because, of course, although the Soviets freed Hungary from Nazi occupation, it was sort of out of the frying pan and into the fire, because the Soviet occupation had plenty of its own problems. But this is the spot to see virtually all of Budapest in one great vista. We should talk a little bit about the Hungarian language, just because it's so unusual. If you travel there, you'll find that almost everybody speaks English to some degree, certainly in the city. If you go out into the countryside, into small villages, you'll find that older people are less likely to know English. But most young people, anyone under the age of 40 or 50, knows at least enough English to be able to communicate with travelers. This sign in one of the parks gives you an idea of just how bizarre Hungarian is. It is not really related to any other language in Europe, so it is much harder for people to pick up. And other than maybe learning hello, goodbye, please, and thank you, you'll find it rather difficult to get started if you're only there for a short time. This mouthful actually means let's greet our guests, and it was part of a campaign to make Budapest more welcoming to visitors. Just a few more street scenes of the beautiful architecture that you'll see through the city. This oddly lit up modern complex is called the Palace of Arts, and it's a new state-of-the-art performance center that was built just a few years ago, a little bit south of the main center of the city. And at night, it not only is lit up, but it changes color and throbs and has light shows all along the side of the building. They have art shows, music, theater, all different kinds of performances. And even if you don't go to one of the actual performances there, it's worth it to walk down to see just how dramatic an addition it is to the river front, particularly at night. Traffic in Hungary, or in Budapest at least, is rather insane, and you certainly don't need to rent a car. There's a variety of cars, including some extremely old ones like this. The best way to get around is either by just walking or using the bus or the metro. We're going to take a little trip up one of the largest boulevards on the Pest side of the river. It's called Andrássy út, and it's named for a count who was one of the major key politicians during the 19th century. And he wanted Budapest to have a grand avenue that would rival the Champs-Élysées in Paris. So they created this 2-mile-long boulevard that's divided in the middle with a park, and it leads to a major park area that we'll see shortly. There's a number of important buildings along this avenue. This is the Hungarian State Opera House, which, like a lot of the other major public buildings in the city, is just beautifully decorated. There are other museums along the route, but probably one of the most interesting things about Andrássy út is that that central portion has a historic subway, and it was built in 1896 to take people from the riverfront, or very close to it, all the way 2 miles east to Heroes Park. This was the first subway to be built on the continent, um, in Europe. And it originally used horse-drawn carriages. The subway stations are still quite beautiful. They have that original looking subway tile and beautiful decorations. It's very, very shallow compared to a lot of subways that you would see built today. In fact, it runs barely a few feet under the street level. You only have to walk down a simple flight of stairs. And it is part of the modern metro system. Here you can see one of the more dramatic, very modern and recent metro stations. And of course, the newer stations were completely differently designed because they are many floors below the street, unlike the single line that runs in a straight line from the river along Andrassy Út. This is the modern subway. You can get multi-day passes, which are great for visitors that allow you to easily get around the city inexpensively. But this is the street from street level. There's parkland down the middle, but it's 2 miles of very gracious buildings, very wide sidewalks, and definitely has a Parisian feel. About halfway down is another one of the major sites to see. If you're only in Budapest for a few days, this is probably one of the most important monuments to visit. This is the Terror Museum, which sounds like something you wouldn't want to do on vacation, but it really is one of the best museums in the city. This is the former headquarters of the Nazi and later the Communist secret police in this building. In World War II, Hungary tried to play both sides against each other, but Hitler finally invaded and installed his own government until a couple of years later, the Red Army came in and ousted the Germans and installed a Soviet government. This museum has several floors of absolutely superb exhibitions explaining politics of the war, the entire 20th century, and Hungary's place in it. It's extremely powerful, has a lot of first-person objects and narratives and films that give you a great insight into a part of history that many of us in the US don't really know a lot of the details about. On the outside of the building are memorials to many of the people who were killed during the secret police pogroms under Soviet rule. And the whole avenue is just a beautiful place for strolling, where you can see elegant buildings. Here's a good example of the juxtapositions in Hungary, where you can see a very expensive new sports car, and just behind it is one of those very old cars that's been on the road since the 1940s. There are monuments to very famous people throughout Hungarian history, mansions, a good many of which have been turned into embassies for foreign countries. And when you get to the end of the street, 2 miles down the road to the east, you come to Heroes Square, which was built starting in about 1896 and over the next couple of decades. The statues that you can see all depict famous saints and kings and revolutionaries that have to do with Hungarian history. There are huge, wide boulevards in this whole area, and the plaza is also surrounded by some of the best museums in the city, the Fine Arts Museum and the Hall of Art, which have European and contemporary art collections in them. The street that they front on is called Parade Street and used to be used for gigantic communist gatherings. This is the area where, if you recall, that enormous grandstand that Stalin used with his huge statue was located here. And the plaza was able to be filled with thousands and thousands of people. Now it's just a very busy multi-lane street full of traffic, but there's parkland along the sides. This unusual sculpture is called the Time Wheel, and it was installed in 2004 and when Hungary entered the European Union. It has in the middle, you can see where the glass is, there's a hourglass, which is supposed to gradually work so that the sand moves from one side to the other over the course of an entire year. Hungarians have pointed out, though, that although this was designed to represent the entry of Hungary into the European Union, the sculpture actually doesn't work. And many people comment on that as a symbol of Hungary's involvement in the EU today. To give you an idea of, again, some of the new and old of the city, this is a major Dutch financial company bank that has an unusual modern building right across the street from the old art museums. And this amazing sculpture, which was built at the 50th anniversary of the 1956 uprising. This is a symbol. All of these rusted steel columns are supposed to symbolize the masses of Hungarian people coming together. And as you can see, as the metal pieces come closer and closer together, they become one and are no longer rusted and are beautifully shiny. You can wander around inside this sculpture. The whole area around the parade street is known as the city park, Városliget, and it's the site of an enormous millennial exposition from 1896, where there was, they built a zoo, they built restaurants, a children's park, and a whole number of buildings that exist today. Essentially, this is the site of an old expo, like many other cities around the world have. Buda Castle, which was actually built out of wood for the 1896 celebration, still is there. People liked it so much that they rebuilt it in stone. And it has 4 different sections. There's a Romanesque section, a Gothic section, a Renaissance one, and a Baroque one. And now there are exhibition spaces and museums. But the castle that you were looking at is not real at all. It's just a reconstruction built 100 years ago. The parkland is enormous, and there's a number of statues, including this one to George Washington. Here's some more of that castle building. And an unusual monument, probably the only one I know of in the world, to the writer Anonymous. All the buildings that you can see here are fake. They may look hundreds of years old, but they were actually built only for this exhibition, just to create a beautiful park-like atmosphere for the expo. But today it makes a great spot for strolling around. And at the end of the day, you should reward yourself with a visit to the Sachini Baths, which are the largest in Europe. Now, you'll remember earlier in this presentation, we visited one of the other bathhouses that was a very old Turkish-style bath. This is built in a very elaborate Grand Baroque style, and it was built in 1913, so it's completely different and absolutely enormous. This is an aerial view that shows you just how large it is. There are countless indoor pools and also a number of enormous outdoor ones as well. Hundreds of people can be there at any one time, and it's worth it just for the experience. You don't have to have your own bathing suit or anything like that with you if you've forgotten it. Anything that you could possibly need, you can rent from them. So you can rent bathing shorts, bathing caps, whatever you need, and there are changing rooms, and then you can enjoy for as long as you want any of the facilities, whether they be saunas at different temperatures, wading pools at different temperatures. There are outdoor swimming pools. And you can see just how many people are going there on a regular basis. These are not tourists. These are, for the most part, city dwellers who just, for them, this is a very ordinary, enjoyable activity like going to the park. Some people come to play cards or read a book. The places where you can change are also quite elegant. There are even people playing chess. This is a completely different style and experience from the more atmospheric old style Turkish baths, but they're both worth trying because they're a good example of what daily life in Budapest is like. And it just feels good. After a long day of walking around the city doing sightseeing, it's great to just relax in a pool of bubbling hot water and get refreshed in an elegant atmosphere. And then afterwards, you can head off for dinner. Right across the street is the zoo that I mentioned that was built at about the same time. So you can see it has a certain degree of that unusual Art Nouveau style. With a dramatic entrance with animal carvings. And then as the sun is going down late in the afternoon, you can stroll around the Heroes Square, watch the sun hit the art museums, and then eventually take the metro all the way back into the center of the city, where you can stroll around and find a good restaurant and enjoy the street life that is Budapest. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. That's it for now. I want to thank you for traveling with me, and I will hope you will enjoy traveling again once the library reopens. In the meantime, please join us online where you can see other travel presentations like this, or on WCAT. And again, for more armchair travel photography, please do follow me on Instagram at The Traveling Librarian. So see you soon and keep exploring. Thank you.